from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Well, there are a lot of things that you get taught in school, and one of the things that I remember being taught was the idea that it was Copernicus who published this book on the revolutions of the celestial spheres and had figured out the fact that the earth revolves around the sun. And it was controversial in his day. He was advised not to publish this for fear of retribution, and so in fact it was not published until the year of his death in 1543. That's a good way to avoid retribution, okay? And so that is when it was published, and so this is what I was taught, and this is probably what you were taught in school, except that when you actually dig in a little further, what you learn is that an ancient Greek astronomer named Aristarchus had actually written this somewhere around the year 250 BCE. That the fixed stars and the sun remain unmoved, that the earth revolves about the sun on the circumference of a circle, the sun lying in the middle of the orbit. Now, it's kind of written in third person because his book was actually lost to history. And what we do have is a book written by Archimedes. Remember the guy, in the bathtub, Eureka, the whole thing, all right, about water displacement? And it was Archimedes who wrote a book later in that century who quoted Aristarchus. And so this is Archimedes quoting Aristarchus, understanding that he had figured this out. He had also figured out that the stars were really far away. He said they have to be, okay, because they don't appear to move. And so he figured out that they have to be really, really far away. And so he understood all this. And we've understood other kinds of things. The idea that Eratosthenes, that's a tongue twister, had calculated the circumference of the earth to within 1%. All right, and he did it in the ancient world. And a part of the reason why the ancient Greeks had figured this out, all right, Aristotle had figured out that the earth was round. And they had all figured this out partly because, or mostly because, as the center of world culture, you had so many travelers from different countries that they encountered, and they listened to their views. And some of the things that they figured out were that, hey, wait a second, as they talked about things like stars and the constellations and stuff, they figured out that people from different parts of the known world saw a different sky than what they were seeing. And so when they put this all together, like, wait a second, how is it, that if you're from way up north, you're seeing something different than what we're seeing? And so they put it all together, and they figured it out. And then somehow, between then and the 1500s, we forgot it. Or did we forget this knowledge so that it became controversial? Or did we decide we didn't want to believe it? Okay? Because what we believe is often a choice that we make. We like to think that we are beholden to facts, but we've seen so much in our world that is not the way people work. Okay? We actually choose what we're going to believe. There are all kinds of studies that show that we choose the facts that we are going to accept, and we tend to choose them in accordance the agendas that we bring to the discussion. And in that time, and to a large extent in this time, the church had an agenda. And contrary to what you may have heard along the way that it was the Catholic Church that was greatest in opposition to the teachings of Copernicus, and it actually historically was not. The Pope was actually intrigued by what Copernicus had written. All right? It was the Protestants during the Reformation who banned the teaching of Copernicus's ideas. It was the Protestants who said, no, 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 we need to have the earth, we need to have humanity at the center of the universe. God would not have created a universe without us. And so it was not, in fact, the Catholic Church that persecuted these beliefs, and the dedication of Copernicus's book actually includes the Pope in its dedication, although a lot of people say that was strategic, that it was sort of preventive, that, it's really hard for someone to condemn a book that they're mentioned in the dedication of. And so there was a thought, by the way, any of you authors, just remember that trick. So anyway, they decided that might have been his agenda in doing that. But the historical reality is that it was the Protestants who banned it because they thought that Copernicus's knowledge about the sun being at the center of the solar system, that the earth revolved around the sun, would upend other beliefs that they wanted to foster. And this idea of upending beliefs that you hold, and maybe hold really strongly, is, I think, the center of this passage. Jesus comes out of the temple, and the disciples are so impressed because, we always need to discuss and remember just how massive the temple was, how massive Herod's temple was. It was an amazing building. The stones were covered in gold on the outside, and it was blinding when the sun reflected off of it. All right, this is such a massive, massive building that you really couldn't conceive of it being gone. The largest stone was 35 by 18 by 12. This is like a studio apartment in Manhattan, okay? And in fact, when you look at the measurements, what I realized, we didn't know this, our stage is kind of biblical. It really is. It's almost 35 feet from the side rail to the side rail. It's actually 12 feet 8 inches from the stage floor to the bottom of the protrusion that holds the organ pipes. And it's actually 18 feet from the front step to the back wall. So that'll give you a visual. Imagine a single stone, the complete width of this stage, going all the way up to the bottom of the organ pipe and from the back wall out to the front step, and that was the size of a single stone in the temple. Okay. Of course, after our project, I'm convinced that the blueprints called for a stone that was 30 by 15 by 10, and the contractor got it wrong. But, that's just the way it would have happened. But when you see something that large, you presume permanence. It's so large, it is so imposing, that it's really difficult for people to think that it might be temporary. And yet Jesus said, look, all the stones are going to be thrown down. Inconceivable destruction. Inconceivable destruction like we experienced with the Twin Towers. Inconceivable destruction like society felt when the Titanic sank over a century ago. These were things that people could not imagine were going to happen, but we've been through this. We've had this. We've believed things that we did not believe could happen, and they happened. All right? And the hardest ones are actually mental. Only we can tear those down. And there are, in fact, giant stones in our thinking that need thrown down. There are so many presumptions that are present in our point of view that we bring to the world, and they tend to surface unexpectedly, and they reveal a rigidity, they reveal a way of thinking that maybe wasn't intended to be harmful, but actually is harmful in our society. Now, there's a slide that I used in presentations that I was giving 2 decades ago. So 20 years ago, I was coordinating the Presbytery's participation in a national youth event. And the registration form comes in. So this is 20 years ago, and I had to take a shot of this because it seemed natural to them at the time, although I sent in some feedback, shall we say, for a very simple reason. And again, it was innocuous to them 20 years ago, but it was this on the form. It was, indicate your racial ethnic background, check 1. I had a kid turn the form in, ignoring check 1, and wrote percentages next to several of the thoughts, okay? Now, they were out of touch, and they thought this was innocuous, but think about what check 1 means for their presumptions about relationships. What does check 1 mean about how they presume couples become couples? All right? So they didn't intend this. They didn't intend this to be an insult. But a lot of folks were insulted. A lot of folks were insulted by the idea that you would have check 1 for a child's racial, ethnic background. Are you kidding? Okay. It's out of touch with reality. It wasn't intended to be insulting. It wasn't intended to harm anyone, and yet it was sending this message that somehow interracial relationships are not normal, that interracial relationships don't fit any of the boxes, all right? And this is one of the things in our society that we have to unlearn. You know, we have to unlearn the idea that normal somehow sits at the center of our society, as opposed to understanding that no, it is a breadth of understanding that is the center of our society. So all of these things that I was taught that I've had to unlearn, things that I was taught about gender or gender identity, things that I was taught about sexuality, all of these things that I was taught, I've had to unlearn, all right, because that is actually who we are as the people God created us to be. Okay? So I've had to unlearn all of those things. I've had to unlearn the idea that neurotypical is the center of society, but rather we have to embrace the neurodivergent as well. You know, all of these things that were big stones in our societal thinking, where we become better as we embrace a broader way of thinking, as we throw those stones down and build something newer and better. And so within your life, whether it is at a societal level or at a personal level, which of your foundational ideas need to be revised? What are norms that you presume that are actually out of step with who people are, with who humanity is as God has created us in our wonderful diversity, and somehow some of these foundational ideas may have side effects that cause you to act badly, even inadvertently so, because your core ideas need to be updated. But when we begin to understand that God's plan, God's design for us is one of a greater beauty and a greater diversity and a greater acceptance than what we had been taught as children, sometimes we're a little slow and we ask questions like the disciples. See, I always love this question because I hate this question. Jesus tells them what's going to happen, and their question is, well, when? Because when we realize that things are changing, we often want to defer the change. We want to know how long we have before we have to deal with what's coming. But this is so much the wrong question. That once you understand that the society, that God's plan for society, God's plan for humanity is moving forward, the better question for us to be asking is, how can we help? If this is what God intends for us, if this is how God created us, if this is the way we are supposed to be, we shouldn't want the status quo to continue. We shouldn't sit back and wait, but rather we should be proactive. Once you understand God's direction, God's movement in the world, God's design for the world, we're supposed to be proactive in bringing it about and not just merely resigned to having it happen. Are you resigned to it, or will you help make it come about? So many voices will lead us away from what God wants. And Jesus warned of this. He said, "Many will come in my name. They will say, I am. And they will lead many astray." Jesus has been teaching that he needs to die and be raised. But he's warning there will be false claims, false teachers, false teachings. And one of the false teachings is the comfort of the status quo, is the comfort of how things had always been. And by the way, just so you know, one of the other false teachings that's very common out there is teaching you that the way things have always been is the way things have always been, when in fact things have not always been the way people like to say they've always been. Okay. There's a great book that I read. It's out of print now, I think. Might have been revised. It came out maybe 20 so years ago. It was called The Way We Never Were. It was unpacking all of, just statistically, sociologically, unpacking the fact that for everybody who was taught that American society was built around a nuclear family and all this stuff, and they go back and go, well, let's go look at the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and let's go look at the rates of single parenting, let's go look at the rates of divorce, let's go look at all of these statistically from back there, and you see, it was there in large numbers. We just chose not to believe it because it didn't fit the narrative that we wanted to put forth. And so you have so many people out there fighting progress and labeling progress in our society with all kinds of pejorative terms, when in fact I think that it's leading us toward the kind of society that God wants us to have. Because one of the ways to be led astray is by being led to stay put, we don't have to work for progress in our society. We don't have to work for making things better. The easiest way to defy God is to fail to move when God asks us to move. The gospel leads us to follow Jesus. The gospel leads us to work for justice. The gospel leads us to work for acceptance and inclusion. And then you've probably seen this. Maybe you've experienced it. You ever take your dog for a walk and it just goes, I'm done. I think that's a lot of Christians. When Jesus is leading us on a path forward, leading us on a path to a vision of a just society, a fair society, a diverse society, an inclusive society, and a lot of people claiming the name of Christ just go, sploot. I love that term, by the way. It's one of my favorite made-up words, sploot. Christians just go, sploot. We're not moving. Jesus is tugging on the leash and saying, no, there's a better world we want you to make, a more inclusive world that we want you to make, a more just world that we want you to make. And a majority of people who claim the name of Christ just go, no, I'm done. I'm just going to sploot right here. And it's one of the most frustrating things very frustrating to see that, because there's so much more, there's so much out there that's better that we could be achieving. And Jesus, when he talks about this passage, and he talks about the temple being destroyed, and he says it'll be rebuilt, and so many people hear this, oh yes, Jesus was trying to remake religion. It was a metaphor for remaking faith, that the temple would be destroyed and rebuilt. It's a metaphor about remaking religion, and yes, it is a metaphor about remaking religion, but what good is a remade religion if it doesn't result in a remade person? Transforming religion does nothing unless it leads to a faith that transforms each one of us. Unless we are transformed by the faith, doesn't matter if the religion is transformed. If it doesn't make us different, faith is useless, yet we so often resist the radical rethinking that would take us on a new path, because we want to avoid the struggle of embarking on a new path in our lives. But Jesus says it's not going to be pleasant. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. The new path is hard. It goes against all of our core ideas. Whatever things may be at our core, it is so difficult to put God ahead of them. All right? It's so difficult at times to put God over patriotism. It's so difficult at times to put God over money. It's so difficult at times to put God over our ambitions. These things are painful, and we resist them. But often we have to ask ourselves, where is that resistance coming from? When we hear about these ideas for moving our society forward into the future, not being locked in the past, but moving toward a better world, a more inclusive world, and a part of us resists, we have to ask ourselves why. What's the agenda within ourselves that's causing us to resist? And maybe that's the sign that that's the path we need to go down. Maybe for ourselves, we need to consider taking the path of greatest internal resistance. That when we hear God calling us to create a more godly future, one where each person who is created by God in the image of God is valued, loved, respected, and lifted up. Maybe our visceral desire to reject certain things that God is calling us toward might be the signal that that is in fact the growing edge for us in our lives. Because we choose what to believe, and we want to choose comfort. But Jesus said, God chooses the birth pangs. God chooses the disruption. God chooses the upending of what had been in order to make way for something better and more just and more inclusive. Because Jesus did in fact come to take that relationship with God and not abandon the persons in a relationship with God, not abandon the Israelites, no, but rather simply to expand it, to take the relationship with God away from a specific people exclusively and include the rest of the world. It was an expansion from exclusion to inclusion that people objected to in Jesus' own time. And it's an expansion from exclusion to inclusion that so many people object to in our present time. But we're called to choose the discomfort of moving into that inclusive future that God intends for us, even when it's uncomfortable. Amen.